Aloha and welcome to this screencast on the RadGrad data model example application. This is an application I built to help you become familiar with the RadGrad data model. The RadGrad data model is not super complicated, but it's also not trivial to understand. So I'm hoping that as you muck around with this sample application and try to understand how it works, you'll get a better understanding of how the data model is designed. Now, before starting with the data model, I recommend that you be sure that you've at least skimmed over all of the pages in the RadGrad org site, in particular all the basic entities, some of these capabilities, and then also have a look at this data model page, because there I try to go ahead and show not only the structure of the Mongo collections that provide the backing store for the data model, but I also try to give a high-level entity relationship diagram perspective on how things are supposed to fit together. So just to review, the way you read this is you say, okay, we have a student, and then a student, and you look, what is their relationship to a degree plan? Well, you look at this, the connection right to the degree plan heading from the student. So a student has a one and only one relationship with a degree plan. So a student should always have a degree plan associated with it, and they'll only have one degree plan associated with it. Reading back the other way, a degree plan is associated with one and only student. So that's a one and only one relationship both ways. Let's look at this other one here. This one says that a student can be associated with zero to many. That's what this little zero with a little teepee thing, triangle thingy, or crow's feet, I guess you call it. So a student can be associated with zero to many prediction instances. A prediction instance can be associated with one and only one student. So we always create a prediction instance with respect to a specific student. Similarly, a recommendation instance is created with respect to one specific student, but a student can have zero to many recommendation instances associated with them. Finally, we've got the tag situation where a student could have no tags associated with them, or they could have many, and any particular tag could be associated with no students to many students. And similarly for the degree goal. So that's how this entity relationship diagram stuff actually works, if you've forgotten. And so it's good to go through this page as well, because you'll start to see, okay, we've got this degree plan. A degree plan is created for a student and contains some collection of opportunity instances, work instances, and course instances. And you can kind of see here this one-to-one relationship. So if you got your degree plan and there's a single student ID in here, but there's a list which could be potentially empty of IDs to these course instances, opportunity instances, and so forth. Okay, and when I do the entity relationship diagram, I'm only kind of just showing the ID field for default. Obviously the student has a lot more stuff associated with it. You can see that up here, but when I draw the ERD diagrams, I don't put in all the fields because it just gets messy. And similarly, we have courses, course instances, and semesters, and opportunities and work and so forth. Okay, so take a look at that. And having done that, hopefully we're ready to kind of dive into the data model example. It's based upon two packages that I've created called RadGrad lib and RadGrad core. So if we go to Meteor Atmosphere and you search on RadGrad, you can see these two packages here. Okay, so they've been published, and you can get them out of Atmosphere when you want, and in fact that's exactly how we do it in this sample data model example application. Okay, and so then we're going to show how we define instances of these entities in the data model. So an actual example of a student, an example of a course, and so forth, and create all those relationships between them. And then and that happens kind of on the server side when we load this application up. On the server, we'll be defining these things and throwing them into the Mongo collections. And then we also, of course, have our client, and we want to be able to show how we retrieve this stuff from the client and display it in a very basic manner in a web page. And so that's also what this application does. Okay, so let's go. I have it running here on localhost, so that I just type Meteor. And to log in, basically what you would do is you're going to want to look into the file where I define users, and for this sample data, I even show you what the password is. So we'll log in as johnson@hawaii.edu with the password foo. Obviously, I don't use that for any of my real accounts. And having signed in, I picked that one because that's an admin account, which means that all of the data in the data model is provided to the client, so I can essentially see everything. Okay, if I logged in as a student, say for example, as Sergey Negrashov, who has the role student, I would only be able to see their data. I wouldn't be able to see, for example, Anthony Christie student data if I was logged in as a student. So there's some basic kind of protections going on here. But anyway, I'm logged in as an admin so I can see everything. And what I do is take each of the entities, users, degree plans, degree goals, tag type, all of these entities, and I just print out their contents. Okay, so I'm retrieving things from Mongo and displaying them in a table. Okay, and hopefully, by doing that, you get a reasonably good idea of how to manipulate things. Okay, and of course, all this data is made up. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing is when the system starts up, a sample data set is loaded, and the data set is defined in all of these files on the server side under sample data model in the definition. So we have the subdirectory where, for example, for courses, we define a global variable called define courses, which is a function, and it creates this little array of objects, which is kind of the data for defining a course. And then we call this RadGrad course define method or function, passing it the data, each element of this. So it's as if we invoke RadGrad course define with the data in this particular object. Okay? So you might be asking yourself at this point, well, where is it that I understand how this RadGrad course define object works? And that turns out to be on this page. So the README file for the core package has an API, and it shows for the course. We have, it shows you kind of what the schema is, because that's kind of important to understand. And then we have the RadGrad course define method, which takes a course definition. We have an example of the, all of the arguments that can be passed to it, and so forth. So this particular page, the RadGrad core README file, is where you can kind of see unfortunately not every single method that's possible to apply, but I think all of the method that you'll be interested in for each of these things. You can see the kind of the formal definition here, but it might be enough simply to look at these sample invocations to understand how things are working. Now note that when I pass in tags, okay, even though in the data model, notice we have these doc IDs, so the underlying collections are actually storing and retrieving the doc IDs. That's a Mongo concept. But when we are defining things, in certain cases, instead of providing the actual Mongo doc ID of a tag, we're providing this other thing. This other thing is called a slug, which is a string that we define along with things in order to refer to them logically someplace else. So it turns out, for example, this sample course, ICS 212, will have a slug associated with it called ICS 212, and then other places where we need courses, when we're defining them, we can use this slug instead of the doc ID, and it will look up the doc ID when it does the definition, and that's kind of nice because, if you reload the database, your doc IDs are going to change and so forth. And it's also a little bit more kind of human and readable. Okay, so that's how we define courses. You can see here's an example of defining degree goals. We're just going to go through all of these files in this particular subdirectory, just define functions which do create definitions. They don't actually do the definitions themselves, right? They're defining a function which, if that function were to be invoked, would actually do the definition. So the question is, well, that's great. We've got all these things defined. When do we actually invoke these things in order to get our data model populated? And that's done in the subdirectory or in the sample data model load datamodel.js file. And you can see here, first we call some kind of top level functions which delete everything in the data model and make sure that everything's deleted. That's kind of just almost a testing level thing. And then we actually start invoking these functions that we defined inside that definitions directory. And it's important to note that order is important. So if we look at, for example, the defined tags, okay, so we're going to define some tags, and what we see here is that we have to specify with each tag, we have to specify its tag type. And the way we specify the tag type is via a slug, in this case CS disciplines, which is a symbolic logical reference to a previously defined tag type. And if that tag type can't be found in Mongo, then the system's going to get an error. So if we look, in fact, in tag types, we'll see, okay, here's that CS disciplines tag type being defined, and here's the slug for it. Okay, so because of that, because of the fact that certain of these objects require other objects to be defined before they're defined, the order here is important. In particular, for example, we have to define tag types before we define the tags, because the tags are going to want to refer to tag types. Similarly, we need to define opportunity types before we define opportunities, because opportunities refer to opportunity types, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the other thing to know, just because of the way Meteor works, Meteor loads things in subdirectories before it loads things in upper level directories. So by virtue of the fact that I put all these definitions in a subdirectory of sample data model, that guarantees to me that these files will be loaded prior to trying to load this load data model file, where I'm actually going to invoke the functions that were defined. Okay, so that's why that little that's why that's structured in that way. Okay, so that's basically how we've loaded the sample data set on the server side. And I've gone through those little things. So now we want to say, well, how does this user interface work? Okay, so I've shown you. Did I show you? Yeah. Anyway, I showed you. After we log in, you can kind of scroll down and you can see that wow, we have all these different little panels in the user interface, which are displaying all sorts of things. All the different things we saw, over here. We're actually seeing real live examples of it over here. Okay, now, so the next thing I want to do is talk a little bit about how it is that data is retrieved and displayed. So looking at the users panel, there's different roles, and we've talked about the fact that if you're an admin, you can see all the data. If you're a student, you can't see everything. So let's look at the template that is used to render that specific user panel. And it looks like this right here, and it's very simple. There's a well, there's users, there's a table, and the table basically just displays a description object, and that is using triple curly braces. So it's not escaped, it's going to be put in there directly, and then we have this other tag, or shoots, I forget the correct name for it, but anyway, it's going to invoke this markdown processor on it, which is really kind of cute. It means that we can put markdown in our text and have it be rendered as HTML. Okay, so if you were to go look at, I guess we could go look at this just for fun. If we go look in app, sample data model, definitions, student profile, okay, what you'll see is that the about me string contains some markup. In fact, it contains the markup representation for a hyperlink. Okay, right there, you got those block angle square braces followed by the parentheses. That's how you indicate a link, and in fact, that's going to be rendered into HTML when we display it. Okay, so let's go back to, okay. So we've got this. This is our template definition, super simple. And it's the template invokes this user list helper function. And just to show where that is, okay, right here, see this user list? So we're going to iterate through each element of the array that's returned by invoking this user list helper function, and then we're going to display that. So how does that helper function actually look? What does it look like? It's simply going to return a map over all of the user objects, which we get by calling RadGrad user find .fetch, and for each user we are going to return an object which has their picture if it exists, and plus this description field where we've basically extracted stuff from the the underlying Mongo collections. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of this, but it's good to kind of go line by line. So you'll see that the way we construct the name field is we take our user, and that's an object. It has a first name field, a middle name field, and a last name field. Notice we're using ES6 string template functions. Okay, so you got the backtick, and then we've got these $sign thingies to get it, and then we have a little markdown in there. That's what these double stars are. That's to make the thing look bold. And then we have the roles here. For the slug, okay, this is a little more interesting. When we actually look at the slug ID field, inside this user object, we've got a slug ID field which will have the slug ID, but we want to show the actual string for that slug, and so what we do is we invoke RadGrad slug find by slug with a slug ID. That returns a slug object, and then we get the name field of that. Okay. Similarly, we take the user's doc ID, and then we call the RadGrad user get email function to return the email address. When things could be potentially empty, we have to check that first. Degree goals, we're going to map over all the degree goal IDs. Given a degree goal ID, we're going to return the result of calling degree goal.find1 with the degree goal ID. That returns the degree goal document, and we extract the name field from that. Okay, so that's how this this works, and it's not complicated, but it is a language. It's a library, and you're going to have to start to learn to use these functions to extract the kind of data that you want. And so that the reason why I built this whole thing is so that hopefully when you're asking yourself, hey, I've got a user and I have to figure out what are the tags associated with it, well, you can dive down into the code here and you can start to see, oh, okay, well, the user has this interest tag IDs field associated with it, and in fact I could call this function right here, get tag names. It's going to return a list of the tags associated with it. Okay, so so that's what that does. Okay, then we have this. This is probably the most complicated define function in the sample data set to define a user, because we've got a lot of things we got to hook together to make a user work. So the first thing we do, I'll just go through this really quick, is that we're going to say, well, I need to know the doc ID, the Mongo ID of this Anthony Christie user ACID. And so the way I do that is I find the slug associated with Anthony Christie, and that has an underscore ID associated with it. And I'm sorry, I use the RadGrad user find by slug, passing a slug that returns the user object, and I just get the doc ID field, the underscore ID field associated with it. That's my ACID. Now I can start defining the work instances, the course instances. So this is work instances for a couple semesters, and I define the kind of the arguments for defining a work instance in this array of objects. And then once I've got the arguments, I just call this mapping function, underscore map, and I'm going to say I'm going to invoke this define method on each element of this sample work instance data field. Okay, so now I've got all my sample work instances defined. I'm going to do the same thing for course instances. I'm going to create an array with the data for each of the course instances that I want, and then I'm going to call this map function to invoke the course instance define method on all our course instance data. Again, I'm passing this student ID because I need it. For semester IDs, I can call this RadGrad semester.get method and pass it a term and a year, and it will return the ID associated with it. For course, I have a slug for the ICS 311 course, and you wonder, well, where is that defined? Well, that's going to be defined earlier in the loading process. So if we were to go back and go to sample data model, what you'll see in load data model.js is that I'm going to define my courses before I define Anthony Christie. Okay, that guarantees that ICS 311 is actually going to be around when I need it in this file here, which is this file right here. Okay, so same thing for opportunity instances. It's really all kind of the same thing. I define it, and so once I've got these course instances, opportunity instances, and sample work instances, then I can define a degree plan, which I do right here, and then at the very end I just set some of these other fields for this user, including a picture. Okay, and their graduation semester is the last thing. So that's how a student gets defined, and it's it's a little complicated, but not really. All right, that's pretty much the most complicated thing. You can now at this point kind of go through the rest of these, and I think you should be able to suss it out on your own. So for degree plans, you can look at the template here. You see that we have a helper method called degree plan list, and then we're going to output the description object rendered from Markdown into HTML. And so if we go to degree plans helper function, that's this degree plan list right here, which you just saw. We're going to map over the results of calling the degree plan.find.fetch method, passing in a degree plan, and then we extract the course instances, the opportunity instances, the work instances, build up that description string, and return it. Okay, and really at this point it becomes highly repetitive. For all of the remainder of these tables, we're always doing the same thing. We've got a basic template, we've got a basic helper function, and then in the helper function we're going to go through and, oh, that's not good, sorry about that. We're going to basically call our RadGrad functions to extract the right data from the objects that were passed. Okay, so that is the, that's essentially it. This is the data model example application. So I recommend that you download it, run it, make some changes to the objects that you're defining, make sure that the system will reload, and then you'll be ready to go off and define your own data model.